We live in a world of overabundance, yet the gap between the rich and the poor continues to dramatically deepen. The 26 richest people on the planet now hold the same wealth as the 3.8 billion poorest, 50% of the population. Occupy Wall Street popularized the term the 1%, the notion of a nebulous ruling elite that holds a wildly disproportionate concentration of wealth and power at humanity's expense. But those who sit at the top of the pyramid, the financial behemoths running this oppressive and violent economic order, have largely operated in the shadows, until now. The new book, Giants, answers in great detail the commonly asked but little-known question: who really pulls the strings? Through exhaustive research, sociologist Peter Phillips outlines the top $17 trillion investment management firms, which control over $40 trillion in wealth, and exposes the few hundred people who decide the investment of global capital. Peter Phillips is a professor of political sociology at Sonoma State University and the former director of Project Censored. While in the Bay Area, I sat down with Peter to learn more about those who hold the reins of empire and capitalist hegemony. Let's get started by talking about the state of the world today as a result of our global economic system. Can you give us a quick assessment on the current state of human civilization?
Well, 80% of the people live on less than $10 a day. That's all the people in the world. So there's only 20% that we would call the middle class, so to speak, and then about 1% who are the transnational capitalist class. Those are the really, really rich people. So for the bottom 80%, $10 a day is not very much, and half of those, half the people in the world live on less than $2.50 a day. And the bottom third, over 1 billion, live on $1.25 a day. So that gross inequality is dramatic. In fact, we have 800 million people that are nutrition malnourished, and 30,000 of them die every day from starvation or malnutrition. So we have an ongoing slaughter of people who aren't, and there's more than enough food in the world to feed everybody. So, I mean, a third of the food in the world is wasted, but it's not profitable for capitalism to try to sell them that food, and it's not profitable to give it to them, so they won't do it. So they're just seen as surplus people, and they're allowed to die. So that I consider, a major humanitarian crisis in the world today.
But Peter, the proponents of global capitalism have told us that that's been decided already. We've tried other systems, that capitalism is the best for humanity. What's your response to that?
Well, they argue that it's going to trickle down and that they can continue to grow capital. And that's part of the problem with capitalism, because you have this concentration of money, of capital, that continues to need to grow and expand because they want a return on it. And so when I write about the giants are these transnational investment companies with over $1 trillion worth of assets that they're managing. And a trillion is a lot. I mean, that's 1,000 billions. So when we talk about money in the world, free-flowing money, they've got the core of it, for sure. And where they invest, investing in the 100 big companies that are putting out CO2, 70% of the CO2 in the world is coming from 100 companies. So, I mean, it's massive negative impacts on the world, the environment, and people are getting poorer and thousands are dying every day.
It's hard to think that would be the best that we have possible.
There's got to be a better way. I mean, we have resources in the world. We could take care of everybody. How we do that is not to make people richer or concentrate wealth more, but to share it better and to make sure that there's, all the resources of the world are trickled down or there's a river down, a flow of money so that people can have an adequate living, they can feed their children, they can engage in productive activities.
And your book, Giants, largely focuses on the profiles of the power elite, which you call the activist core of what's called the transnational capitalist class. Explain this concept.
So we know that the 1% of the world, 8 of them have half the wealth in the world. And the top 1%, I mean, they're controlling, 90% of the wealth in the world. So that is very concentrated. So these giant transnational investment companies, the ones who represent 36 million millionaires, 2,000 to 3,000 billionaires, are manage their money for them and invest it in places where they want to get a return. So there are 17 of these trillion-dollar investment giants. They collectively control, in 2017, $41 trillion worth of wealth. So it's just a massive concentration of wealth. And there's only 199 people that are on the boards of directors of those companies. So we have less than 200 people who are deciding the investment policies for 50 trillion this year, $50 trillion worth of wealth in the world. And a lot of those decisions aren't favorable to most people, and it's favorable to them. So they're trying to get a return. That's one of the problems with capital and capitalism, is that it needs to continue to grow. So the problem with this kind of capital concentration is they run out of places to invest it with good returns. But even then, they still have more capital and they've got good places to do it. So part of global, the neoliberal economic policies is to buy up the world, literally privatize the world, so that freeways, highways are bought up, the water resources in the world, it could be universities and cities, I mean, everything, it becomes privatized. And so the public domain is bought up. That's another way of trying to get a return on investment. And even that, there's still more money than there's good place to invest. So we've reached a level now of permanent war.
Let's go back to the players here, and let's call out some of these institutions here, because we hear about billionaires like Jeff Bezos, right? Bill Gates, we hear these names often.
Well, Bezos is the richest man in the world with 160 billion. I think he lost 6 billion last week, which is kind of ha-ha. But, he's the richest person in the world. But he's just one big tree in a forest. So in fact, we didn't even list him in the book as part of the global power elite, because the global power elite, there's a sociology of who's in the forest. These people are interacting together. They're like redwood trees. All their roots are interconnected. And Bezos is just one big tree. But the rest of them are making the policy decisions through a variety of institutions and the direct control of the investment money, the money they're investing, that impact the entire world, that impact us all. They're all invested in each other. So we're a cluster of interconnected capital with very similar investments, all watching each other. And the number of people controlling that could be, fit in a small, mid-sized university auditorium and have cocktails together. They all know each other and know of each other. Most of them know each other personally, and they all go to Davos together and they hang out.
How did we get here? Because 100 years ago, we had capitalist powers warring over, World War I. We saw a lot that had merged, fighting. That's basically why the war happened. World War II, obviously, the U.S. kind of took hold in the world with the dropping of nuclear bombs and instated its hegemony, and now has these collaborators. But how did global capitalism come to this point from there 100 years ago to where it is today?
The short version, essentially, is we globalized. Mm-hmm. So we developed, and it has been developing for a while, people at a transnational level who are in corporations. I mean, the largest 200 economic entities in the world, 150 of them are corporations. So these corporations are massive, bigger than countries, supersede countries in many cases, and then use the WTO rules and the IMF rules and that to loan countries money and then obligate them to invest and do things that will benefit capital and capitalism. So companies are totally in charge of the world. I mean, that's where we're at. Mm-hmm. And they operate everywhere. So Amazon's everywhere. I mean, and they just reached $1 trillion worth of wealth in Amazon. And part of that is massive investments by the investment giants. And so 56% of Amazon's stock is held by transnational investment giants. And that pushes Bezos' wealth up rapidly. I mean, his wealth went up over 50% in just the last decade.
Your book breaks down several components of the transnational capitalist class, how it protects itself and expands this wealth, Peter. You talked about the facilitators, right? You talked about the G30, the Trilateral Commission. Why do you think that people have no idea really, about the think tanks that you're talking about and what role they really have.
The facilitator groups are the ones that actually make policy. Policies of international security and defense, protecting global capital, allowing it to expand and grow everywhere in the world, and undermining governments that resist in any way, that are trying to protect their people with laws or rules. That's the policy of global capital facilitators. These are the people that are advising the World Trade Organization in that to change rules, change laws, implement policies that allow for the continued expansion and growth of capital. The number one policy group that's non-governmental is the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council is made up of NATO nations, representatives from NATO governments, but they're not necessarily representatives of government. They're high-level security people, investment people, intermixed, and big corporate officials, high-level corporate officials. So the Atlantic Council has a large private budget. They're putting out annual reports. These are very powerful, non-governmental policy-making entities. And to help that along, they hire big public relation firms. The big three are Omnicom, WPP, and Interpublic Group. And there's several hundred smaller public relation firms under those three that are they'll put out press releases for governments, state departments, corporations on various policy issues. And then the corporate media, who we call the ideologists, which are also owned by the giants. I mean, they invested in all of them. The big six corporate news media in the world today are putting out as news content what these public relation firms are preparing for them. So, what we hear in the news today is Venezuela is, a dictatorship, and they're destroying the country, and they have socialist orientations, and it's very democratic. But it's also challenged by the elites in Venezuela and by U.S. capital elites here. And so the ideologists, the media, are putting out stories of how terrible they are, which is it's ludicrous.
The ideologists are a very important component of this, Peter. We have the Atlantic Council now working in concert with Facebook to curate the news there. Talk about how problematic that is, as well as just the concept of the ideologists to protect the transnational capitalist class. Because we hear all the time that these beltway publications like the Washington Post and New York Times, they're the premier arbitrators of our objective reality, yet they couch all of their opinions in these so-called experts and policymakers of the exact same think tanks.
So there's massive penetration in that capacity over the last decade. And still, of course, there were Facebook pages that were, and Twitter accounts that were considered too extreme by the Atlantic Council. And those got named, and several hundred of them have now been purged. And we'll probably see more purging going on in that capacity as well. The deeply penetrating corporate media today, 80% of the stories that are coming from television news stories are packaged or prepared by public relation firms working for government or corporations. So 80%, I mean, that's a study that's been validated. We don't recognize the importance of how much news, corporate news, is managed in very deliberate ways to give us certain messages and not allow and not criticize capitalism in any way.
The structure of the corporate media, obviously it exists to protect capitalism. That's very obvious, but how exactly is the corporate media also weaponized for empire? I mean, building these false narratives about everything from Venezuela to Iran in this cartoonish way to build that consensus among the American public.
Well, they're symbolic of how capital is concentrated. So if we've got 200 people managing $50 trillion worth of capital, and the ownership, of course, is spread around, but it's the managers. And the ideologists, the big TV stations that are putting out news in our faces every day, are the same thing. They have consolidated down, and just in the last 30 years, from 50 major media corporations down to 6. And then the Washington Post is now owned by Bezos. So and so they're buying up and or controlling media content worldwide. So it makes your kinds of programs incredibly important. That we have to have these alternative voices out here really explaining what's going on. And I don't say alternative, I want to say that we're mainstream. You are mainstream because you're speaking for the mainstream populations in the world. And these are humanitarian values that we hold, and these are very important kinds of concepts that we have to continue to express in every way that we can. And we're going to get censored, we're going to get repressed in some capacity. There's been zero coverage of my book on giants, the global power elite, in terms of corporate media. And if I get coverage, I'm sure it'll be negative.
I love that you said that our ideas are mainstream, because that's exactly what the corporate media is designed to do, make us feel disempowered, disenfranchised, marginalized. I mean, that's the whole neoliberal doctrine. You know, you're an individual, and if you don't just make it on your own, and you don't need anyone to help you, but we do. And we need to be communicating this with each other, Peter.
Absolutely.
So this is my favorite part of your book, the protectors of the transnational capitalist class. Talk about who they are.
Protectors are NATO, the U.S. military, the police state, and private military. G4S is the second largest private employer in the world, with 625,000 people. The only one bigger is Walmart. So G4S were the people with the dogs up in the Dakotas that were attacking the demonstrators around the pipeline. They do everything from mercenary activities, war-type activities in Africa, South America, to protecting the Israeli settlements from the Palestinians. They do it all. They guard banks, they run prisons. I mean, they're a massive, private security company. If a company wants to have a green zone, a protection zone in the middle of anywhere, they'll do it for them, and they kill people. So, and then of course Blackwater, which is now Academy, is the other big private military group, and Eric Prince is trying to convince Trump to let him take over the war in Afghanistan. And they have their own private air force in Africa. Private security is rapidly growing. International, U.S. military and NATO in particular is all over the world now. And with bases, over 1,000 bases, some of these are lily pad bases in every country in Africa that they can go to immediately. They don't necessarily have troops there, but they build them ahead of time. And occupied, we've got troops in 140 countries, literally killing people, training people, killing people. It's to protect capital. It's not to protect you and me. It's to protect capital and have capital penetration in all regions of the world. And if there's any interference and they want to try to do a regime change with governments, and debt collection. So if a country's in debt and the military is there to really threaten the government if they're not going to return.
So the U.S. military says that this global empire is because of freedom and democracy. You're saying that that's not the case.
It's a lie. For them, freedom and democracy is a freedom of capital to do business anywhere in the world. And corporations are closely linked with what democracy means. It means free enterprise. It doesn't mean people making decisions at grassroots levels about their lives and passing laws and upwardly mobile stuff and regulating corporations. It means exactly the opposite.
As a sociologist, Peter, how do you see the interaction between defense companies and these financial investment firms in profiting off of war?
They're closely interconnected. I mean, all these big investment companies are invested in war. I mean, they make money from it.
Peter, let's talk about an example here. What about Blackrock and its role in this death machine?
Blackrock is the largest transnational investment company in the world. This year, they've got $6 trillion worth of assets that they're investing worldwide. They have $50 billion in Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman each. And so they're doing huge amounts of investment and benefiting from war. They benefit from investments in everything. But a lot of military companies are involved. All the CO2 producing companies are involved. They're just a massive capital investment company. They're run by a guy named Larry Fink, who's from LA. And it's been the most successful. It's not a bank, it's just an investment company. Mm-hmm. And it's been the most successful in the world. So it's huge, it's massive. And he's the one that, he was on Trump's advisory board. And he's very active in encouraging the privatization of Social Security.
Briefly discuss how the corporate media is also subsidized by these very institutions.
The big investors are invested in corporate media. They're also invested in the contractors. So there's clearly an overlap of capital interests.
Well, sometimes it's very brazen because you'll be seeing a report on, let's say, MSNBC, and then you'll go to an actual commercial from BP or from Lockheed Martin, as if the public is interested in buying, weapons or oil.
That's always amazed me that Lockheed Martin will run ads about how wonderful their weapons are.
You mentioned climate change, and this kind of adds a new urgency off of your studies, Peter, and how just, I think, 100 companies are responsible for 2/3 of the global emissions. Where do you see this going? Where do you see the inequality going and the state that you just talked about if we don't correct global capitalism?
Well, part of writing the book was to identify the central core, the 300 people who are vital to the central policy making, facilitating, and protection of global capital. There's other thousands that are associated with that, but to identify who these players are, the idea that these policy groups and this concentrated capital is really managed by these small numbers of people. So we can identify who they are. And so we can lobby them, we can pressure them, we can protest to them. I mean, people in big metropolitan areas around the world, if they're starving, they have no resources, there's a state trying to control them, ultimately they're going to resist in a variety of ways. And governments will, people inside will realize there's a problem and resist. So we see resistance movements all over the world. And, whether it's Bolivarian movements in South America or workers' movements in China, or what we had Occupy here, another Occupy type movement occurring, that all makes them afraid.